Welcome back to Let's Read Darksiders, the Abomination Vault. I'm BurningDogFace, and last time we read the introduction and the prologue. Now, it's time to actually catch up with our protagonists as we begin Chapter 1. The ashes seemed to go on forever. A thin layer at first, very much like a gentle coating of gray, clinging snow. Deep enough, if only just, to retain the imprints of passing feet, or would have, had there been any. After barely a few finger widths, however, the fine particles began to compress, suddenly and swiftly. A light dusting became a shifting grit, then a sucking mire. And below even that, the ash had lain so deep, for so long, it had condensed into a layer as unyielding as any earthen crust. If this world even had a surface beyond the omnipresent dust and cinders, it was buried so utterly that it would never again appear to the living. It filled the air as well, that ash, casting a constant veil across the face of the horizon. It diffused the light into perpetual dusk, blotting out the lingering embers of what had once been a sun. For those rare few unfortunate enough to pass through, it smelled of burnt oils and singed meats, clung to the nostrils and throat in an oily film. The wind was perpetual across the barren land, unimpeded by mountain or forest or wall, refusing to ever let the choking soot settle. Equally constant, audible over the roaring winds, only if one made the effort to listen, came the tolling of an impossible and impossibly distant bell. It could not exist, did not exist anywhere in this blasted realm, only a lingering echo of what once was. It sounded not so much in the ears as in the memory. Not merely a dead world, this, but a murdered one. What wide and varied life had once thrived here was long since stripped away, leaving nothing behind but death. And more recently, death. He stood at the edge of a colorless dune, before a squat, rounded structure, little more than a blister in the ashes, browned and pitted with age. Even the wind-swept soot seemed unwilling to touch him, rushing around him in short, sharp flurries. The soles of his age-worn boots remained atop even the flimsiest layer of packed ash, as though he were weightless. Or perhaps again it was merely that the ash wanted nothing to do with him. Hair as black as a demon's shadow hung to his shoulders in matted, greasy locks. Below them, torn and stained streamers of bruised violet fabric whipped and trailed from the back of his belt, perhaps the only remnants of what had once been a tunic or cloak, perhaps something more. The dark leathers and piecemeal armor he wore from the waist down, and the fraying strips that wrapped his palms and forearms, were equally grimy and unkempt. The skin of his exposed torso, shrunk tight over a wiry frame, was the dull gray of a corpse, even without the filth in the air. Only the deeply scored mask hiding his face from all creation still retained some semblance of cleanliness, of its original bone white. The gaping sockets, through which eyes of burning orange gleamed, unblinking, and the mask's general shape, were enough to evoke a skull in any viewer's imagination. The lack of mouth, or most other features, somehow made it even worse. No sentient being remained anywhere in this world to gaze upon him, and the ash-choked air would have made him almost impossible to see, even if there were. And still he did not remove the mask, had not, in fact, even given thought to the possibility. It was a part of him now, an immutable barrier between who he was and who he once had been. Death stood, his hands raised before him, his mask shuddering slightly as his mouth formed constant, silent chants. The magics of the oldest Horseman swept through the winds, delving deep into the ash, and where nothing lived, the ancient dead responded. Bones, petrified by time and stained by soot, worked and wiggled like snakes on their way to the surface. They punched through to open air, rearing into a veritable thicket and slowly pressing themselves tightly together. They danced, however briefly, to an orchestra that only death could hear. Long since dried to flecks of powder, the blood of 1,000 corpses transformed once more to liquid, sluicing and bubbling from the depths. Where the bones did not fit perfectly together, that blood surged into the gap, mixing with ambient ash to form a thick, viscous mortar. And where the macabre construction required more meticulous handling than the raw material could manage, there appeared Death's helpers. Ghouls, the desiccated corpses of beings never native to this world, materialized from the ether, reanimated and drawn through the walls between realms by the Horseman's will. With mindless obedience, but impossible precision, they arranged the jagged bones just so. With surprising rapidity, guided by Death's magic and servants both, a low building began to form over and around the smaller structure. Every so often, faces appeared briefly in the ash to study him as he worked his necromancies. Phantoms, perhaps, of the world before, or maybe just tricks of the light. He sensed the sudden surge of life, a creature appearing nearby where there had been none. At the same moment he heard a warning squawk from above. Wings beating rapidly against the wind, shedding mangy feathers, a hefty crow circled twice and settled on his shoulder. "Yes, Dust." Death's voice was low, sonorous, a stale draught from a yawning sepulchre. "I feel it, too." He raised a hand, and the weapon he'd casually laid aside heaved itself into his waiting grip. The scythe was enormous, taller than its wielder. Its blade was a hideous thing, jagged and crafted like the wing of some great beast, longer than Death's outstretched arms, fingertip to fingertip. The ghouls ceased their labors and turned in unison, ready to march at the slightest thought. Dust emitted a second piercing call and took to the air once more, partly to scout for enemies, yes, but also in part to remove himself from possible danger. "Coward," Death said, though his tone was not unkind. He squinted, peering into the soot-thickened wind, and made a swift decision. As quickly as he could think it, his scythe flowed, fluid for less than the blink of an eye. Death was now holding 2 weapons where there had been only one. 2 crescent blades, thick and heavy, shaped like knives, but larger than most swords. Blades that would be easier to swing and thrust with the violent gusts than the longer, broader scythe. "I didn't know you could do that." Death had never heard that voice, high and sneering, before, but between the sound and the silhouette appearing through the cloud, he recognized his visitor all the same. "I am Death," he said simply, without pomp or vanity, "and Harvester is bound to me. Whatever tools I require to serve my function, it can emulate. Hello, Panoptos." "You've heard of me! I'm flattered." The dusky figure that finally materialized was peculiar even by the Horseman's standards. Gaunt, almost spindly, humanoid from the waist up, tapering off into semi-solid vapors below. Its arms and fingers were stretched and distended, its wings serrated and broad. Its oblong face, like Death's mask, lacked anything resembling a mouth, though this didn't stop it from speaking. Instead, it boasted an array of emerald eyes, shifting and flowing across a vaguely gelatinous surface. 9 of them, usually, though between the constant motion and the fact that 1 or 2 would occasionally disappear only to sprout anew, the number varied moment by moment. "Don't be. The Charred Council told me about you," Death said. "My brothers told me more about you. Care to guess who I'm most likely to believe?" "Ah," the creature sniggered softly. "Surely you know better than to listen to rumor and gossip." "Depends who's spreading the rumors." Death allowed Harvester to return to its innate form, that of the single great scythe, and leaned it against the partial wall of bone. At his silent command the ghouls resumed their labors. "So," Panoptos said, flitting this way and that, untouched by the wailing winds. "Welcome back. Such a lovely home you've chosen. Very you." Already concealed beneath the newer walls of bone, the older inner structure had apparently escaped his notice. It wasn't an oversight Death felt compelled to correct. "I enjoy the view." "Strife said you were a sarcastic bastard." "What do you want, Panoptos?" Clearly the creature had no interest in answering Death's question, at least not yet. "Where have you been these past centuries, anyway?" "I wouldn't tell the Charred Council when they asked. What makes you think I'll tell you?" Again that irritating little laugh. "Why, it's a gesture of friendship! I so want us to be friends." "It's good to have goals. Keeps us motivated," Death told him. "But I wouldn't wager anything you can't do without, were I you." "How unkind! We've only just met." "And I already despise you. Imagine how much greater my loathing will become when I have gotten to know you." Panoptos might have had a retort for that, or not, but Dust chose that moment to decide the newcomer was safe after all. He dropped from above to settle comfortably on Death's shoulder, puffing out his feathers and shaking off the worst of the soot. Every one of Panoptos's eyes blinked in unison. "Where did the bird come from?" he screeched. "His name is Dust," the horseman said. "That is not what I asked." "And yet it's the answer you got. The universe works in mysterious ways." Panoptos darted upward, apparently for no other reason than so he could look down on Death. "Does the Crow Father know you've absconded with one of his creatures?" he asked petulantly. The council's errand boy doesn't care for surprises. Could be a useful thing to know. "What do you want, Panoptos?" he repeated. "I have work to do." "Indeed you do. I'm here on behalf of the council." Death just looked at him. "Ah, well, yes, I suppose you guessed as much. Listen well, then. A phalanx of the White City's finest soldiers was ambushed recently by an unknown enemy. The Charred Council wishes you to learn who and why, and to know." 4 or 5 of the creature's eyes threatened to pop from his face. "What do you mean, no?" "I wasn't aware the word had multiple meanings," Death said. "When you returned," Panoptos growled, "after half a millennium, you told the council you were finally ready to assume your duties." "And I am, when necessary, but I'm not required for this. Angels under attack? It's hardly the council's affair at all, unless it represents a violation of the treaties of hell. Assign one of the others. War and Fury are always eager to—" "The council sent for you," Panoptos said. His voice had grown so cold, frost practically formed along the edges of his words. "I'm busy trying to make a home for myself." Death began to turn back to his endeavors. "You'll want to look into this yourself, Death." "Oddly, I don't." "Oh. Did I neglect to mention that this happened at the borders of Eden?" Death spun back quickly enough to dislodge Dust from his shoulder. The crow offered an offended caw and fluttered over to perch, sulking, on the half-built structure. Even without a mouth, Panoptos gave the impression of a sly grin. "I suppose I probably ought to have mentioned that first thing, shouldn't I?" The horseman's fists were clenched around the haft of Harvester. He didn't even remember summoning it back to him. Had Panoptos been nearer, it might well have been his throat in the weapon's place. "What were the angels doing there? Did anyone breach the garden? Did the assailants get in?" "I don't know." Perhaps realizing he'd pushed a bit further than was safe, Panoptos rose even higher and his tones softened a touch. "Honestly, I don't. The council's only now hearing first reports of the engagement." "Anything else you've neglected to mention?" Death rasped up at him. "Only that the council wants you'll report the instant you have an idea of what's happening. They need to know if this is just another random skirmish at the edges of the treaty, or if something larger is underway." Without another word, Death began striding across the desert of ash, leaving the ghouls to finish the work on his home-to-be. A whistle pierced the air, shrill and painful, one as much spiritual as physical. And something both spiritual and physical answered the call. If the reek of decay and the crushing weight of hopelessness took physical form, they would have been the same putrid green as the mist that billowed out of nothing a dozen paces distant. A growing staccato beating resolved itself into the sound of hooves. Other than the grubby mane and tail, the horse that finally appeared was hairless. Its skin was nearly the same corpse-gray as Death's, and hung open in ragged tears, displaying bone and rotting muscle. From those wounds, from its nostrils and between its broken teeth, and from cracks in its hooves, that mist seeped in constant clouds. The saddle was black leather, worn and tattered, the bridle a rusted chain. Death hauled himself into that saddle with a single smooth motion. Harvester, despite its length, never once impeded him. Scarcely had he settled when dust landed once more on his shoulder. Death nodded once to the crow, a second time to his mount. The horse broke into a gallop that should have been impossible on the soft and shifting surface. For the first time in 500 years, the eldest of the horsemen rode out into creation to do the bidding of the charred council. Before them, the walls of reality parted, as ephemeral as cobweb and just as readily swept aside. The barren world on which Death had made his home fell away, less palpable than a forgotten dream. And they were elsewhere. Or more accurately, nowhere. Above and all around them were swirling currents of white. Not white mist, or cloud, or haze, just white. Calling it nothing lacked accuracy, as this was no absence, but a presence. It just happened to be the presence of emptiness made manifest. The only real substance wound below them, a snaking trail of reality on which the beast's hooves trod without sound. Held steady and solid by the power of the horseman's will alone, it was quite literally a path between worlds. The rolling whiteness around them, muffled sound, offered little sensation of motion. But here distance had little meaning anyway. The journey from one reality to the next would take as long as it took, and not even Death truly knew why. The tedium afforded him the opportunity to think on what had happened. It wasn't necessarily an advantage. Eden. He could have gladly gone until the end of time without ever again hearing the name Eden. A garden realm of wonder and beauty, peace and plenty. Set aside ages ago, for the sole use of a people not yet born, by the express command of the Creator himself, in an earlier age when he still occasionally deigned to speak with his creations. Eden was quite possibly the nearest thing in any reality to a true paradise. Perhaps it should have been no surprise to anyone, then, that the Nephilim, caught forever between demon and angel while belonging to neither, a lost and vicious race, had attempted to annex it for their own. It was the last world they ever invaded, the end of their reality-spanning rampage. Many of their corpses still rotted beneath the surface, feeding all manner of ancient power into the soil. It was a past that Death would have been quite content to leave buried and gradually forgotten. Apparently someone out there didn't feel the same. The horse abruptly tossed its rotting head, uttering a spectral call somewhere between a whinny and a moan. Yes, despair, Death flicked the reins idly. I am paying attention, and I know precisely where we are. I'm not about to get us lost. The creature, despair, whickered with blatant skepticism. If we're not there shortly, the horseman offered, I promise I'll let you take the lead. A final ghostly snort, then silence once more. Briefly. It was only a few moments later that the billowing pallor surrounding them began to waft away, thinning to reveal the first signs of an actual realm. Despair's hooves began, once more, to make muted thumps in the dirt. Dull patterns of shape and color, very much like blots of dyes and paints not yet dried, slowly resolved themselves into towering trees and heavy brushwood. The light forest stretched from its bed of gently waving grasses towards an azure sky so bright it was almost painful. The gentle gusts of wind were practically unnoticeable, at least as compared with the world he'd just left. And high, piping bird-song filled the air. Only for a heartbeat or two, of course. The wildlife fell unnaturally silent at the approach of the horseman and his half-dead mount, presumably because they were busy scrambling to fit themselves into the tiniest of hiding spots. Beautiful and bucolic, but certainly not Eden. Nor had Death expected it to be. The garden was isolated in the boundaries of creation, as defined by the tree of life. Not even a horseman could simply enter at will. No, like any other traveler, Death had to wend his way through ancient forests on unclaimed worlds near the heart of reality, until he located the single trail that allowed ingress to that most precious domain. The first signs of unrest, when he finally came across them, were not difficult to spot. Entire swaths of trees had fallen, cut down by potent magics and brutal weaponry. Splintered wood and tattered leaves, churned soil and scorched earth, stretched as far as Death could see. He could smell the blood, still wet and seeping into the dirt, but he didn't need to. He felt the death's imprinting on the landscape, sensed the newly freed souls slowly fading from the air. Dust! The crow squawked in acknowledgement and took wing, spiraling high and far, watching for any hint as to what had occurred, or for any imminent danger. Death dropped lightly to his feet, leaving Harvester lashed to the saddle, in the full knowledge that it would answer his call should he need it. He crouched, studying the soil, but all he could tell was that a fearsome struggle had taken place. That much I knew already. He pressed his fingers into the rich loam, then raised them to his mask. The blood was angelic, as he'd anticipated. What he hadn't expected was to find only angel blood. Whoever their opponents might have been, either they did not bleed, or the soldiers of the White City had not managed to injure a single one. The first prospect was far less disturbing than the second. Too many signs, too much death and blood in a confined area. The Horseman couldn't hope to follow any one trail back to its source. If so many had been slaughtered here, though, where were the corpses? Why did only spilled blood remain? Death straightened and carefully studied the wounded forest. No sign of any other observer, enemy, or ally, but something was off. It was nigh impossible for anything living to hide from him. Yet had someone lain concealed at that precise moment, he wouldn't have been at all surprised. He couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear, couldn't sense, but he did not feel alone. A shrill cry from Dust interrupted Death's musing. The crow was circling deliberately over a spot of woodland some few hundred paces away. "All right, I see you." Death didn't bother shouting. He knew Dust would hear, regardless. He opened his hand, calling for Harvester to settle comfortingly into his grip, and turned back towards his mount. "Looks tight in there," he said of the thickening trees. "Follow if you can. If not, I'll call when I need you." Despair whickered once in reply, a distant, uninterested sound. With an impossible grace, the horseman slipped over, under, or between the obstacles in his way, leaving the ravaged swaths of churned earth and shattered bodies behind. The protruding boughs might as well have been hinged doors, the overgrowth a rich carpet. On the very rare occasion when the trail was too thickly occluded even for him, Harvester carved a path with no effort at all. He sensed Dust's discovery long before he could see it. The growing miasma of blood and early rot, the almost corporeal tang of the soul's recent passing, all served as heralds of what lay ahead. The angel had fallen in a thicket of brambles and dead leaves as brittle as old parchment. A small gap in the canopy allowed a single finger of sunlight to prod tentatively at the body, as though it were afraid something in the foliage might leap out and bite. Without his personal attunement to the scents and sensations of death, and without Dust having spotted the angel from above, the horseman would never have located the remains. No wonder, then, that whoever had recovered the other bodies had also missed him. Death pushed through the thistles and thorns without pause or even a second glance. The sharpest tore at the pallid flesh in his arms and bare torso, leaving shallow gouges that failed to bleed. If he felt the trifling pains at all, it showed neither in his gait nor in his gleaming eyes. Oddly wide and jagged gashes formed abstract patterns across the angel's broken body. A carpeting of bloody feathers surrounded him in a disturbingly neat circle, having been knocked and torn from his battered wings. The intricate angelic script on his gleaming breastplate was marred beyond recognition, and the blade of his glaive was badly notched. It had struck something, repeatedly, yet no blood marred the edge. A moment to plant Harvester a few inches deep in the soil, where it stood, like some petrified pennant, and then death knelt beside the fallen soldier. He held his left hand, palm down, above the corpse's heart, the right with fingers curled towards the sky. His mask quivered as he incanted syllables that no humanoid mouth should ever have been able to produce. A fragment, the tiniest sliver of the angel's departed soul, split away, swept back through the worlds by the horseman's necromancy, and though the blood did not flow, nor the lungs draw breath, the eyelids fluttered open as the angel awoke. And, that was Chapter 1. So this is about the point where I tell you that, yes, this whole thing has been just kind of a goof, so happy April Fool's Day. I hope you've enjoyed it. So, yes, tomorrow we will be returning to our regularly scheduled programming of Let's Play Control. And, I don't know that we'll be returning to this book anytime soon. Although I did get some people who seemed interested in the joke when I mentioned it last year. Yeah, that's why I picked this one. I mentioned it by name when I was musing about it last April. So, I guess if you actually do want to see more, hey, let me know in the comments. If there's, actual interest in this, I could see fit to keep going. Otherwise, I'm BurningDogFace, and I'll see you on my next video. Later!